Hello, welcome, I'm Bella May and welcome to this channel. It has been a while. We've had a pause on my 18th century project. I've only put a few videos out so far, the chemise, the under petticoat, and the false rump. And it's finally time to get back into videos about that project. And we're talking about stays this time. Stays are corsets of the 18th century. They were not called corsets in the 18th century. They were called stays or a pair of stays. If you've been here since the beginning where I've shared about this project, you'll know that I've come to the decision to completely hand sew this project, which is kind of crazy, but it is a goal that I've set for myself. So these stays will be 100% hand sewn. Continue watching to see that journey and my thoughts on the process of hand sewing stays. It's a lot of work, and stay tuned to the end to see if I thought it was worth it or not. And as a quick reminder, I started this project back in March, and I started it 2.5 weeks before my deadline. There was a historical picnic event that a friend was hosting that I wanted to attend. It was 18th century themed. I did not have anything of the 18th century made, but it was 2.5 weeks that I decided I needed to make an entire 18th century project outfit, all of it. It was crazy, but the reason I decided to do that on such a quick deadline, I was in a slump and I needed to sew something. I needed to do something other than computer work and video editing and all that comes along with being a YouTuber, Instagrammer, whatever you want to call it. So I decided to put that deadline, set it in stone, buy the event ticket so that I would actually do something. I work by deadlines, and so it was crazy, and deciding to hand sew it on top of all that was another whole thing, but it got me sewing and it got me inspired, and so I hope these videos maybe inspire you to pick up a project and just get it done and have fun with it. So with that, let's get started. Originally, I was going to use a pattern from this book, Stays in Corsets. It walks you through how to draft your own custom size corset in a variety of different styles. There's 2 different volumes to this, and I will link these books down below because they are very helpful. I've made a pattern or 2 from them and I got a great fitting corset. So in this one, I believe it's volume 1, it has some great 18th century stays. I almost was gonna go for one in it, but then I saw this corset and I really liked the look of it and just the style and the simplicity of the design. And then I was going through this book, which is Corsets and Crinolines by Nora Watt, and I saw this pattern in here, which looks strikingly similar to this one. And it says it's a red silk damask outside, and that's what this one is. So I think it's the same one, but there's a few differences, such as this shows that the shoulder straps come up and tie with like 2 eyelets here, whereas this one is obviously not any ties, it's just straight up. And then also there's just like slight variation. So I don't know if it's different, but overall it's a very similar style. And I really just like that I can look at the detail of this picture and copy those details. I'm very visual, and so seeing something that I like and the stitches and how they did the binding and all that just really makes me happy. So I decided I'm gonna go for this. And in this book, she gives a pattern for it, but it's very basic. It just shows the little inch diagram at the bottom. And so my solution to upscaling it to the proper size is to just take a photo with my phone, and I just make sure to square up that square border with the edges of what my camera is taking. And so it's not a warped pattern. You could also scan it, but I decided to just go this way for this time. And I brought that picture over to my computer and brought it into Illustrator and then scaled it to the correct size with that little inch diagram that's down there. And then I just made sure the picture was white, contrast high, and then I got it exported from Illustrator on the different pages. This is my whole setup, how I create patterns, and so I already have it all formulated. There's other ways to do this, but for me, it's Illustrator with these print setups. And so then I export it and then get it printed up and assemble the pattern from there. Have you ever come to a point where something is interfering with your happiness or preventing you from achieving your goals? I certainly have. Whether you have a clinical mental health issue like depression or anxiety, or if you're just a human who lives in the world who is going through a tough time, therapy can give you tools to approach your life in a very different way. I know for me, these past few months have had some crazy ups and downs. That's why I've been slow around here. And talking through these things with someone is such an important step to healing and learning from those challenges. And that's why I'm excited to tell you about today's sponsor, which is BetterHelp. BetterHelp's mission is to make therapy more affordable and more accessible. This is an important mission because finding a therapist can be really hard. BetterHelp is a platform that makes finding a therapist easier because it's online, and by filling out a few questions, BetterHelp can match you to a professional therapist in as little as a few days. It's easy to sign up and get matched with a therapist. There is a link in my description. It's betterhelp.com/Bella. Clicking that link helps support this channel, but it also gets you 10% off your first month of BetterHelp, so you can connect with a therapist and see if it helps you. If you get matched with a therapist and you don't really fit with them, which is a common thing in therapy, you can easily switch to a new therapist at no additional cost. It's just a simple switch. As I've found in my own life, the next step is so often just to tell someone and talk through your challenges. So if you're struggling, consider online therapy with BetterHelp. Click the link in the description or visit betterhelp.com/Bella. Thanks again to BetterHelp for sponsoring today's video. So once I got the pattern out, I'm actually gonna make up a quick mock-up of the pattern as it is and see what it's looking like. It's only about an inch or so different, my bust measurement and waist measurement, compared to the pattern. At least I'm pretty sure. If it's the same pattern as in the two books, then I would know the measurements for the pattern. But in this one alone, it doesn't give the waist and bust measurement. And with the angles of the patterns, I'm not sure how I'm gonna figure out what areas of each pattern are the waist and the bust and measure them correctly, sort of, if that makes sense. And so I'm just gonna make up a quick one and then visually see how they all attach together and kind of try it on, even though it will just be a mock-up and I'm not gonna put any boning or anything in this mock-up. I'm just gonna see if it's around the same size. And if it's around the same size, I'm just gonna go ahead and make it because I don't have time to make a lot of mock-ups. I'm just gonna go for it. We'll see how it turns out, but I'm pretty confident that if the measurement is looking right, then I'll be able to construct it and it will be a good pair of stays, hopefully. I'm trusting my ability at this point and hoping it works out. We'll go from there, but I want to talk about the fabrics, and I found a great article that I will link down below that walks you through the steps of making a pair of stays, the different assembly, and also the fabrics that were used and all that. It's great, just concise article with great pictures of how you do the seams and stuff, because I was curious how you assemble it because I've never done stays before. One of the fabrics that she talks about, there's an outer layer and then 2 canvas linen layers typically, and then a lining. And so for the 2 canvas linen linings or interlinings, 2 fabrics, and you like put the bones between those 2 canvas linen layers. I have this thick linen that I think is kind of the right type of fabric. It's something I just had in stock and I actually pulled it out to make the under petticoat out of, but I have extra, and so I'm pretty sure I'm gonna use this for those 2 layers. And based on her thread count that she gives of what was typical for that canvas, it is very similar to this fabric that I have. And then for the outer fabric, this is where I feel a little stupid, but a while ago I picked up this gorgeous brushed damask looking twill fabric. It was cotton, it was beautiful, it was so nice. And I got it like 2 years ago, and I had planned to make a pair of stays out of it. I got it out, it was looking great. I decided to throw it in the wash because, you know, it'll be grand. It was not grand. But anyway, I wanted to wash it because I knew I wanted to spot wash like in the future these pair of stays, and I didn't want that like wet marks of spot washing it to be very visible because the rest of the fabric hadn't been washed yet, never touched water. So I threw it in and I pulled it out to put in the dryer, and what happened to the pattern? I have no idea. It just like disappeared. So, yeah, it's very close up. You can see that there's some sort of pattern to it. So I have this little swatch that I took a while back when I was making my swatch book, and you can kind of see the raised pattern that it had. It's gone. So learn from my mistakes. Don't just throw a piece of fabric that you plan to use because it's so pretty in the wash without testing it first or researching it first. Either way, leap year might have influenced my decision because I just watched that and, you know, throw it in the wash. It'll be grand, you know? Doesn't always work. Not a good idea all the time. But at the same time, maybe this was meant to be, because while I was researching stays now, I saw that towards the later part of the 18th century, you didn't see as many like decorative type looking stays. They were more of like a plain woven twill, or sometimes cotton, and often wool. So a lot of more just plain colors, like a light brown or white even, or cream or whatever. And so it was more like the earlier part of the 18th century that you saw more like damask and printed and stuff like that. So when I was researching it, I was like, well, maybe I shouldn't use this because it doesn't seem as accurate for the era that I'm going for, which is more later 18th century. I guess I got my wish, because now it's more of just a plain twill fabric without a pattern. So that's kind of fun. Not really. So hopefully that mistake helps you not make a mistake, or not as major of a mistake. And the best thing we can do with mistakes is just learn from them, laugh at them, and move on and just deal with it and do the best you can with what happened. So that's what I'm gonna try to do, and not try to picture the very pretty pair of stays that would have been achieved with this beautiful fabric that I had. But 'tis life, and I'm gonna now try to make these pair of stays. So after a quick mock-up of the pattern, it seemed to fit well enough to move on to using the pattern with just a couple minor adjustments. The original pattern does not have seam allowance, and is honestly how I like to work with my patterns anyway, to get a precise sewing line. I first laid out the patterns and then cut them out of the linen with about 1 inch to 1.5 inches of seam allowance. Next up, it's cutting out the outer fabric using the linen pieces as my guide. Once these pieces are lined, it's time to mark out the pattern and then baste along those lines for each pattern piece. With all the pieces prepped, it's time to mark out all the boning lines. I am having to adjust some of my channel width based on what bonings I have in stock and what I'm going to use for each spot. So I'm first marking which channels those different size boning will be in and getting an accurate measurement of each boning piece. I'm using a combination of 3/8 inch, 1/4 inch, and 3/16 inch synthetic whalebone. Really, it's just a combination of what I had in stock. To get an accurate placement of each of these channels, I'm cutting out sections of the pattern that will allow me to line up and then easily mark those channels in place on the fabric. And for the marking, I'm using this fancy chalk wheel type thing that I discovered when my mom and I were sorting through her old sewing supplies from her days of quilt making. I didn't know such a magical thing as this existed. It's a game changer when it comes to chalking line, and it's called a Choco Liner Marker. I think they're the best invention since, I don't know, they're great. Even though I like using tailor's chalk, this is like 1,000 times better. But anyway, something I found to be helpful in marking is to only mark one edge of the boning channel using the pattern, and then use a clear ruler to evenly mark out the second edge. Once all the channels are marked, it's time to get them all sewn. This is done by using a back stitch through all the layers along the chalk line. or at this point you could go bring it to the machine and sew through it all. But as I mentioned earlier, I'm hand sewing this, so we are forgetting that a magical machine could very easily do all this sewing, and we're just doing a backstitch by hand. I am very thankful right now that I chose a half-boned stay instead of the fully boned stays, because that would have been covering the entire piece with boning channels. So this still has a lot of boning channels, but it's not covered. So I'm thankful for that. So I did a few tester ones, not really testing, it's the final seam, but I timed myself and it took me about 12 minutes to do one seam, or one stitch line, I guess. So I estimated that I have about another 2 hours of hand sewing on the rest of this front piece to get it done. And then there's 3 more pieces to create the half of the stay, and then it will be repeated, of course, on the second side. So I will time myself, see how long it actually takes. I am definitely estimating that it's just gonna be many, many hours of hand sewing, and I'm sure my fingers are gonna be raw by the time I'm done, but that is why I am using this thimble. I don't often wear a thimble because I just find it really annoying, but I also know that my finger has been damaged many times by a lot of hand sewing, and so definitely on this, especially with the thick fabric, you need one, but I stay away from the metal thimbles. Personally, I really dislike them. They slip off my finger all the time, and so that's why this little rubber one is my favorite, and I will link where I got it down below because I was so happy when I found this one, because I tried all sorts of other kinds and they just didn't work. And also, I have decided to use a linen thread for this project. I decided to wax my thread because one, this linen thread, it's like it has a lot of, I don't know what you'd call it, like almost not fraying, but it's a lot of like wispy little ends of the linen. And even though it worked fine, I noticed that with all the sewing, the thread just kind of became fuzzy, and I didn't really like how those stitches started appearing as I got further down the seam. It's just like a fuzzier look. That is something that I've noticed other people have done with their threads. I knew it was a technique, but I never really understood why, because I always worked with, well, just either poly or cotton threads that you got at, you know, the local fabric store, and I never saw a need for waxing your thread. And so I just grabbed a glob of some wax that we have because my mom makes candles and I make like wax melts, and so we have wax in stock. And so I just grabbed a little piece, put it in a piece of parchment paper, and then I kind of just run my thread through there. I don't know if that is the proper way to do it, but it is how I'm doing it, and I definitely am noticing a difference with how the thread goes through the fabric and just the overall feel of the thread. So definitely recommend doing that if you're working with linen thread. So now I am just gonna continue sewing and sewing and sewing and sewing some more to get this all done. I'm excited, but also a little bit intimidated. I am really excited about this hand sewing because I'm really liking how it looks, and I'm liking just challenging myself to do this. Because yes, it is a little bit tempting to just go to the machine and quickly stitch all these channels out, but because I said I was gonna hand sew it, I am resisting that and just going for it, and I'm really appreciating it, and I really like it. So I discovered something new about myself that I didn't know, that I actually like hand sewing more than I thought I liked hand sewing. Anyway, this is me rambling, trying to ignore the fact that I'm gonna spend like a very, very long time hand sewing this all. So Quick note on the whole washing the outer fabric and the pattern disappearing. So it is an embossed twill. Now, if you know the meaning of embossed, you probably would know that that is the reason why it washed away. And so I really didn't think through the name when I saw it, and I didn't even remember that's what it was when I pulled it out. Basically, the design was impressed onto it. So you had a base fabric, and then the design was pressed. At least this is my working theory. It pressed all the design fibers down, like compacted it, and then the fluffier stuff was just not compressed. And so when I washed it, all the compressed areas re-fluffed up, basically. That's my working theory. So even though it's a bummer, I am still appreciating the fact that it's still a good fabric to make a stay out of. At least I feel like it is. And also the fact that it has just a subtle like design to it kind of makes me feel like it was a used fabric, or I'm trying to, you know, make myself feel good about this. But it feels like it's just like a used fabric, or it's a really used pair of stays. I don't know, I'm trying to theorize here. But overall, it's okay. Moving on. So my stitches are not amazingly even. So if you look at pictures of original pairs of stays and even this red one that I'm trying to copy, you look at the stitches and just how amazingly neat they are and even. My stitches are definitely not like that. I've seen a lot of variation. I even noticed a variation between my stitches when I'm sitting here sewing versus up at my cutting table and just filming some up there and standing up and doing it. My stitches were different. I have no idea why. I guess maybe just the angle of how I was looking at the project. But yeah, definitely not perfectly even. But I am happy with how straight they are turning out, thanks to the chalk lines. Definitely need good visible chalk lines to make things straight. But I am predicting that my stitches will be more even by the time I'm done, because I can already tell that I'm getting more in sync with the fabric and my stitch lengths just by doing it. And so by the time I'm done, I am hoping that I will be a better hand seamstress, hand sewist, better at hand sewing. So here I am a day later, still sewing away. I'm getting there. I'm like almost halfway done. So it took me 3.5 hours to fully do this whole piece. That was a half an hour longer than my estimation. So that wasn't like a terrible estimation, and it's looking so good. I'm really happy with how it's turning out. On this particular piece, I did have to put in some of the bonings before I finished up the stitching, because these 4 or 5 bonings here are blocked completely once you add these upper ones. And so I had to do that, and that's very like satisfying to have some bonings in there and seeing the shape and smoothness and everything. And then I moved on to do the next 2 pieces, the side front and then the side back. The side front took 2 hours and the side back took 1 hour and 45 minutes. So in total, I did these 3 pieces in 3.5 plus 3 3/4 would be 7.25 hours. So it'd be 7.25 hours that I did these 3 pieces. To make up 1/2, there's only 1 more piece, and that's the back piece. But I'm not working on those yet because I'm waiting on some more thread to make the eyelets, just because with the construction of that piece, I could technically mess up that order a little bit, but I just don't want to. So I have plenty of other things I can do until that thread arrives. Overall, it's not taking terribly more than I thought it would. I anticipated quite a lot, so to get it sewn in time by the end of this weekend, I think is very possible. But also, I've got to get my glasses on because my eyes were going buggy after like 3.5 hours of sewing yesterday. And I always mean to get out my glasses when I have a lot of hand sewing to do, but I usually don't think about it until I'm almost done, and then I just don't. But because I've definitely noticed that my eyes just get very tired after a few hours of this detail stitches and stuff. And so this one, I have plenty of time to realize that, oh wait, I should get my glasses out because my eyes are hurting. I'm excited because my eyes are definitely not feeling it as much as I usually would be. Also, something I realized as I'm just doing this is I marked all my channels out with the width that they should be, but just with marking them maybe a little bit incorrectly, and also just the width of the stitches not accounting quite for that, I noticed that some of my channels on this front piece, which is my first piece I did, were pretty hard to get in. And so I tested out a method on the next couple and they were much better. They're still snug, there's not like extra room in the channel, but I was able to get the boning in like fairly easily. And so my method for how to get each channel to be the proper size, after I finish one side of the channel, I then use a piece of boning and just lay it right next to the stitches, snugging it right up to those stitches, and then reinforce my chalk line. And so far, there hasn't been like much difference with that newly marked chalk line, but it just guarantees that my channel is actually going to be the correct width. But also, as I'm working with the fabric, the chalk lines are just slowly fade a little bit and it can be a little hard to see the line. So doing this just helps to remark that line and also in the perfect like spacing from the other one. So that is a little tip for you. And I am just gonna continue going, keep on going, keep on going. Something I've grown to appreciate, but also fear, is the fact that a lot of hand sewing is done without knots. So you learn to tie a knot at the end of the thread and then start sewing, and when you're finished, you tie another knot. Now you have a secure seam. Well, to help with smoothing out seams and not having hard knots, the finer method is to not use knots. So I am in the process of learning this and getting used to it, but I'm still at the stage where I'm careful with how I do this because I don't want my seams to fall apart, obviously. But anyway, this is my current method, and for these stays, I first wove in my needle through the threads of the under fabric for about 1/4 inch, gently pull the thread through till the tail is just in the fabric, and then I do a little sideways stitch through the pulled in tail, but not going through all the layers of the fabric, and then I weave the thread through the fabric again before poking it to the outside to start the stitches. And then at the end of the stitches, I pull the thread to the back and basically do the same thing, a little weaving, a side stitch, and then a little more weave before snipping the threads. So this is my method. There's a few different methods that I've seen online, but I've found this one to be trustworthy and holds everything in place without being a hard knot. Now for the back piece, the one edge of the lining is trimmed away to reduce bulk, and the other 2 layers are folded back and pressed into place. These folded edges are the back edges of the stays. There's a boning placed in that folded edge, so there's a channel line to mark, and then the eyelets are placed beyond that. Stays in this era were spiral laced. This means that there's just one end of cord lacing up the back in a spiral motion, so the eyelets need to be offset from each other to allow that traditional spiral to happen. My eyelets will be 1.25 inches apart at one top edge, and the opposite bottom edge you have two eyelets that are half that distance apart to start creating that offset pattern. Before sewing the eyelets, I'm first going to stitch up that back channel line, and then we can start making holes. But not by punching. You don't want to break the threads of the fabric, so you want to use an awl to separate them. So you poke that awl in through the fibers and then wiggle and turn back and forth to slowly spread all the threads apart, creating the hole. Then you bring in your thread, bearing the tail, and then coming to the outside about 1/8 inch away from the hole, put the needle through the hole, and then come up through the back next to the last stitch, the same distance away from the hole. And you keep doing that around and around. Now there's something I learned to really make the best eyelet. So after you first stitch 1 or 2 stitches, poke the awl back in and help open the hole up again and spread those fibers apart. And you continue doing this every few stitches, or at least till the hole is staying open as you stitch around it. I found that once about half the eyelet is sewn, I only need to poke the awl in once or twice more. Once you've made it all the way around the hole, there you have a finished eyelet. Now do it 23 more times. Okay, so I'm just finishing up the last eyelet, and after that, I just have a few more lines to sew to create the last few boning channels, and then I will be completely done with that part of the stays. All the boning channels and eyelets will be done, and all that will need to be done is all the pieces assembled. So in doing the eyelets, I've discovered that you need about 24-25 inches of thread to do 3 eyelets if your eyelets are about 1.25 inches apart. In this project, I'm being very precise with not wanting to waste my threads, because one, that would be accurate, but I'm really not doing it for that reason. I'm really doing it because I bought this linen thread, which is more expensive, and it's also just thicker, and so I feel worse throwing away longer pieces of it, if that makes sense. I'm used to just like standard cotton thread that's thin and you kind of just, it doesn't feel like anything. But with this thicker thread, I'm like, I want to keep every little piece. And so with the boning channels, you need 3 times as long as your seam because of how the back stitch works. So with eyelets, I kind of was like, threw away lots of thread, and I was like, I need to figure this out. So I measured my thread, and it's 24 inches. That does 3 eyelets, and there you have it, if you wanted to know that information. It takes me about 4 to 5 minutes to do an eyelet. This is like my second project hand sewing eyelets. I am not a pro at them. They look okay. They're not all perfectly even. I feel like I've gotten a little bit better as I've done these 24, but also I really like using a buttonhole stitch on eyelets. I really like the look of them. They just look very neat, but I just didn't see that on this pair of stays and other ones, so I decided to just go the standard way. I mean, if I ever did this again, I would probably do the buttonhole stitch because it's just kind of fun. So after I finish up this one eyelet, I have 3 more stitch lines to do, which will take me about 45 minutes. And that will bring the total amount of hours I've spent doing all the hand stitching on these stays, like all the boning channels and these eyelets. I will have spent 18.5 hours hand sewing. That's not all the prep work of cutting stuff out, basting them together, and marking the lines. That does not include that. That is strictly just hand sewing. So I did that in the course of, this is the 4th day of doing that hand sewing. So that was a lot, and I would probably not recommend doing that much that quickly. My fingers are so sore right now, like it hurts to grab the needle, but I also don't do a ton of hand sewing, so my fingers are just not used to it. But it was a lot, and I'm very excited to be almost done. I definitely have noticed that my stitches have not become neater and better as I've done all this hand sewing. Really, they've become a little less even and overall larger. Like my first stitches were like fairly small, and now I'm looking at my current ones, I'm like, ooh, they're definitely a little bit bigger. That's probably my impatience coming out as I was going through these few days, just wanting to get them done. But at the same time, I'm still really enjoying this process, and I've learned a lot, and I've had fun doing all this hand sewing. My fingers hurt, but it's been fun. And at the same time, I am excited to get it done because I want to try them on, and also I need to move on to the dress because the event is 8 days away. So it's a lot, and I want to get on. I got the fabric from Colonial Williamsburg. It's like a replica fabric that I'm really excited about. I almost was gonna make the whole dress, oh, eyelets done. I was almost gonna make the whole dress out of my pink linen fabric that I have, but I didn't see a lot of example of linens being used for a full dress. And also I just thought, like, with the style that I want to do, linen is just gonna get really wrinkly. And so I just wasn't a big fan of making that happen. And then I was like, well, how often am I gonna make hand sew an 18th century outfit? Not very often. So I might as well get some replica fabric. But anyway, there will be another video where I am making that, like the rest of the outfit. Now that eyelets are done, I'm on to about 45 more minutes of sewing those boning, and then we can start putting it all together. And I'm really excited to try out how they put these seams together. I think it's really unique. I've never done it something like that before, so I'm curious to see how it works. I know my fingers are gonna hurt because it's gonna be going through so many layers of fabric, but we'll talk about that later. But then also, before I go on to that, I saw in the book that I got this pattern from that it said something about the stay makers would like glue or paste or some wording like that. Maybe I should just look it up. No, it wasn't in this one. He began by choosing the appropriate size of pattern from his stock and then onto a sufficient length of buckram strengthened with glue or paste marked out the pattern. So they stiffened that inner fabric. And so my fabric is not terribly stiff. It's thick and it has body and structure. But I decided just to kind of get that same effect, I would just starch it. And so I'm just spraying some starch on the backside of the fabric and then ironing it. And that, I just noticed it helps, like, it just feels better and stiffer. So I decided to do that with all my pattern pieces before I go on to the step of assembling all the different pieces. So first, one linen edge is trimmed away to reduce bulk. Then the seam allowance is turned over just beyond the basting sewing line. You need a little extra room to allow the seam to be sewn. We'll explain this seam later. This folded edge is then pressed in place, and all the seam edges are prepared in this way. Now you line up the corresponding pieces right sides together and pin in place. It's pretty tricky to pin these in place without disrupting the folded edge, and also there's so many layers here, but it is possible. Now start at the start of your marked seams. You horizontally poke your needle through both folded edges, about a 1/16 inch away from the edge. You pull it through and then you bring the needle around and poke the needle in again at the same side your last stitch started at. And when you pull it through, it wraps the thread around the folded edge. It's an overcast or whip stitch. This is what it looks like when it's opened up. For these seams, I did double my thread to make sure it was extra sturdy. The best tip I can give for these seams is to be as even as possible with how far away from the folded edge you poke your needle through. Too little and it catches only the outer fabric. Too much and it created a bulky seam. And then if you go back and forth between distances, you kind of get a weird looking seam from the outside. So just try to get as even as possible. Okay, so in doing this seam that combines the different panels of the stays, it is not my favorite seam. It is I like how it comes together, but there's just so much fabric you're going through. And also I've struggled with like my evenness of the like folded line and creating even boning channels along that. Because as you're sewing this, you are creating the channel, like the second edge of the channel along that whole seam, because every seam does have 2 pieces of boning going on either side of it. And so sewing up the seam is creating 2 channels. So my first seam is pretty good. There's a little bit of unevenness going down the channel. My second seam is really not that great. I'm considering redoing it because there's a couple parts that are definitely going to be too small for my boning. And then my third seam is really very too small for boning to fit into it, except for at the very end. And so I think I'm gonna like completely take that one out and redo it. But I finally did create a system that allows me to get a pretty even seam that will allow the boning to go in. And so my method is to just pin back my folded edge, very like tightly pinning it to the fabric to create a even width of the channel, not really paying too much attention to my basting line because it's just, it's not even enough to really create what I needed it to look like, I guess. Maybe I just basted on the wrong side of the chalk line or whatever, or my boning channel I made too large or too small. I don't really know exactly what I did, but I just found that pinning that back and making sure that the overall width is about like a 1/16 to an 1/8 inch bigger than your boning, how your boning channel should be. Because in the nature of this seam, you're taking in, like it's not as little as a 1/16 and it's not as much as an 1/8 inch, I think. So it's kind of like in between the two that's getting taken up in the seam. And so you have to account for that when you're folding the edge over. You need to have room for the boning and the amount that's going to be taking it in from the seam, if that makes sense. So pinning it, making sure that's going to be wide enough, and then pinning them together has given me much more even seams in the second half of the stays. And so I'm happy with that going forward. I do have to be careful though, because I'm just about to do this side front seam that's on a bias of the fabric, because that stretches while you're doing it and it's like creating some smallness to the channel. So with just how the fabric works, I have to be careful in that one because it's not on the straight grain. So I noticed some warping of that going on. And then I am going to go ahead and attach some, I think they call it welt something to the front of the seams. So it might be welt facing maybe, or welt binding, I don't know. It's the strip of fabric or not fabric, it's usually a linen or silk tape or leather that's covering the seam of the piece. So there's a strip that goes right on top of where you sewed the seam, and it just creates nice lines. It covers up the seam because personally I don't like what it looks like when this seam is like stretched, you see your threads going across. And so I want to add that. And I have decided to use leather for my binding and that welt facing binding, whatever it's called. I can't recall the name right now. But I learned that leather chamois are a good like thickness of leather to use for binding and this type of thing. And so I literally just went on Amazon and bought a leather sheepskin chamois for about $11. I also found a place on Etsy that sold like pre-cut strips of leather binding for stays, and you could go that way, but it was like $20, and I was like, well, save some money, and also I'm gonna get more leather out of the deal by making it and cutting it myself. So I got a leather chamois, and I will link where I got it down below, and then I just rinsed it a bit because it felt like a little bit greasy, not like greasy, but just like it had some residue on it. And so I did rinse it out. I'm gonna see how that dries. We're getting close, very close. I think I spent about 3 hours sewing up all these different panels of the stays, and I've got 2 more full ones to do before I'm done. So about a half an hour to an hour maybe. Those will be done, and I can move on to binding. So for the welting, apparently it's just welting, period. I'm cutting 1/4 inch strips. And then for the binding, it's 3/4 inch. Before attaching the welting, the boning on either side of the seam needs to be inserted. Otherwise, you could end up sewing through the channel as you sew on the welting. So I got the boning trimmed, rounded down the corners with some sandpaper, and then got them in. For the welting, starting at the back of the seam with about 1 inch of leather, sew it into place, and then turn it to the right side. Now the leather is sewn down with a catch stitch, or also called a herringbone stitch. But when making these stitches, the long threads are sewn under the leather, so it's like a hidden catch stitch. The needle is brought from one side to the other, under the leather, catching some of the fabric below. It's pulled through, and then the needle is put in just beyond the thread and brought to the other side, again under the leather, and it's pulled through, and so on and so on. This is done all the way down the seam, and when you get to the end, wrap about 1 inch of the leather to the back and sew it in place the same way you started. So now I have 2 halves of the stays all sewn together, and the seams have their welting. And now it's time to do the final front seam and join these halves to make a hole. The next step is to attach the straps, and that is done with the same seam method. And finally, with all this sewing, it's time to place all of the boning. Once that's complete, the seam allowance is trimmed down and catch stitched in place. Now it's on to some binding. First, the edges are trimmed down, and then from the right side, the leather is attached. The edge of the leather is placed about 1/8 inch beyond the stay's edge, and then it's sewn down a 1/4 inch away from that edge. So your stitch line is about an 1/8 inch away from the stay's edge. You want a fine binding for this to allow for all the movement of that binding. The extra bit of leather placed beyond the stay's edge will be wrapped around the edges and provide extra protection from the boning which is poking out of the stays. Once the leather is placed, the second edge is then turned to the back and stitched in place. Okay, so yesterday I was planning to get the stays completely finished. That did not happen. This finishing work definitely is taking a lot longer. It took me an 1.5 hours or more just to get all the rest of the bones into it. My channels were very tight and I wanted them to be tight and so they'd not wiggle room, but there was a few that were way too tight. I could hardly get them in, and you also have to be careful, at least with this boning, that it can buckle, and if it buckles too many times, it like breaks the pieces. Even one buckle kind of breaks it, but if it keeps buckling like in that same place, it will eventually just be a bend and then break and all that. So overall, that was just a very annoying 1.5 hours as I was trying to get the bonings in it. And then I finally was able to go on to start binding it. And so I really like how it's turning out. I'm not too happy with this part right here because the leather got thicker in that area, and so I couldn't get it very fine. It's like a 1/4 inch binding, whereas the rest is like an 1/8 inch. So I might take that little part out and like trim off the thicker part of the leather to get a tighter fold to match the other, but that's just my perfectionism coming out. The time to do from here all the way around the strap to here, and then I started the first stitching around some of these. That took 2.5 hours to do that much, and there's a lot of tabs to do. So I am estimating at least 7 hours to finish all the binding. So that's a lot of hand sewing, and my fingers, they're finally feeling a little bit normal after not sewing this morning. But just going through all the fabric is very wearing on your fingers. Even if you use a thimble, that finger's fine, but it's the two that you need to pull the needle through the thick fabric. It just hurts after you do so much. And also realizing that so far I've put 40 hours of work into these pair of stays. And a majority of that is hand sewing over the last like 5 days. So all that to say, I've decided to move on to the dress while I slowly finish up these stays. So they are wearable as far as getting the size and stuff, so I can move on to making the pattern and trying it on. But while I do that and make the petticoat and stuff, I can work on finishing up these binding, and then hopefully I'll be at the point where like the fitting stage of the bodice, I'll have these finished enough that it'll really get the full fit. Even though they are like that right now, I have decided to not trim down a lot of these edges until I get 1/2 finished, because I've already noticed just dealing with it, there's a lot of fraying happening. And so to minimize some of that, I'm not trimming that side down. So it looks a little wonky when I try it on now. But for now, I am gonna slowly finish them out over the next like 3 days while I make the dress. So just as a breakdown of what it takes to hand sew, it took 18 to 19 hours to sew all the channels in all the pieces. And again, these are half boned, so it would take more if you're doing a full boned pair of stays. And then it took 4.5 to 5 hours to sew up the seams. And it has 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 seams to sew. And then it took about 3.5 hours to do all the welting. So again, 7 seams. It definitely was not my favorite process because you have those bones in there and it just makes it sort of hard, but I really like the result. It's so fun and I love that it's leather. And remember, all these tabs need to be bound. This is again why you want a fine binding. It allows for all the turns of the corners and crevices. After 11 hours of binding, this is a bound pair of stays. One of the last steps is to create a few eyelets on either side of the shoulder straps and at the top of the stays. I decided to do 2 eyelets at each place. So after I got the eyelets done, I decided to set the stays aside and finish the rest up later. And so I wore it to the picnic like this without the lining. So the lining is the only thing that needs to be done, and it did not affect how it could be worn. So I just went on to all the other things that need to get done before the picnic. So without attaching the lining yet, I've come to 49 hours of work in these pair of stays. That's a lot of work. Honestly, I did not anticipate it would take that long, but I do feel like it was worth it. I am very proud of these pair of stays. There's just something about knowing that you made something all with your hands. Like, my hands did this all. And like, what a gift that is to be able to do that with just a needle and thread and fingers. Like, it's just kind of crazy. And I found that part really enjoyable and encouraging, and just like got me to persevere and endure even though my fingers hurt a lot of the times. And so I would recommend to spread out your time of making stays over a couple weeks or longer instead of like just over a week. But I definitely felt like as I just was binding it and I just did a couple hours in the evening of doing that, my fingers were so much better. So spread it out if possible. Definitely recommend that. But overall, I feel like I am like the proudest I've ever been of something that I've made. Even though I did make the Cinderella dress, there's just something about seeing all the stitches that you like put in. It's just it's really satisfying, and I don't know, it's just really fun, and I really enjoyed making these. There were definitely challenges along the way, so I don't want to be like, oh, it was the most amazing experience, it was easy, it was wonderful, it was perfect. No, there were times when I was like, what am I doing? And there were times my fingers just hurt so much. Guys, I never thought that your fingers would hurt so much from sewing. I just never thought it would be possible. So doing that gave me a new perspective on fingers and how much it takes to pull a needle through thick fabric, and a thimble is a must here. But yeah, definitely one of those things that I'm really happy I did. I don't think I will ever sew a pair of stays by hand again, because I think I'm good, at least for this style. I might attempt like an 1830s pair of stays hand sewn, maybe, I don't know. And now that I said I would never do it again, yeah. But yes, just a really fun, challenging project that once I get the lining in, will be over 50 hours of work. So anyway. And the last step, finally, is the lining. So it took me 5 months to finally get to this step and completely finish the stays. I just put it off, but it is finally done. The stays are laid out on the linen, and then based on the instructions on the blog post, the back edge is supposed to be aligned to the straight grain. But that blog post is making 2 halves of stays with a center front stomacher, but my stays are not 2 parts. So this would be a bit wonky to have that back edge on the straight grain, and both back edges could not be on the straight grain. So I opted for the straight grain at center front. The top of the stays are smoothed out and the linen is trimmed along that edge. The raw edge is turned under and pinned, and then that whole top edge is sewn on. Now for the bottom edge, smoothly lay out the linen to lay across the stays and go over all the tabs. It's a very interesting way of lining something, and I'm not sure how I feel about it, but it worked. It's just one piece of linen used, spread out across without any seam lines, And supposedly this was to allow for an easy changing of the lining when it was worn out or got dirty or whatever. So I like the idea of it. I think it worked fine. I did come into an issue that there wasn't enough fabric width to spread out on all the tabs. So I kind of skipped a couple tabs from the main section, and that allowed me to get most of the tabs sewn, and then I'll come in and attach a separate piece of linen to cover those couple tabs. When it comes to putting it on, I put it on backwards, so the back is in the front, so I can get all the lacing in. And it's just side to side, creating a spiral with the lacing of the two edges. Once all the lacing is in, spin it around to the back and tighten it up. It's not the easiest task by yourself, but it is possible. After you get it tightened up, it's getting all the extra lacing wound up. This is how I've seen other people do it. It's not my favorite way, but we're going for it for now. The last step is to get the shoulder straps tied, and it's finally done and on. There's over 50 hours of work in these stays, and this is the result. I love them. Thanks for watching along and sharing in this journey. Stay tuned for the making of the dress and all the subsequent videos that will be coming out. As always, a huge thank you to my patrons, YouTube members, and Instagram subscribers for their continued support. Appreciate you all so much, and until next time.